Okay, so try to be a little real worldy here. It's simple. Life is simple. Government rules and regulations. We hear about them all the time in the media. Where do they come from? Well, the answer is generally that Congress passes a law. Remember the world, the way it's supposed to be. Congress passes laws, creates them. The executive branch executes. Executive executes. So Congress passes a law, says, look, we need to inspect food before it goes out into the market. We need to inspect beef and cows. And the executive branch then figures out how to do that. So an agency of the executive branch, the Food and Drug Administration, is put in charge of creating these regulations. They create rules and regulations to decide how this gets done. And if Congress doesn't like those rules and regulations, Congress can changeth them. There is a legal process that these rules and regulations go through. This process was created in 1946, so before any of us were around. The government agency writes a proposal. It goes out for public review and comment. The government can't just do it. It's got to go through this period where people who want to comment can comment. We'll talk about net neutrality. We've talked about net neutrality. It turns out there were millions of fake comments submitted by people who oppose net neutrality. They got bots. They did computerized simulations and sent in millions of anti-net neutrality comments that were then included in the record for the deletion of net neutrality, despite the fact the FCC knew they were fake comments. And then, of course, courts can review. So the courts are now reviewing the decision of the FCC to remove the net neutrality restrictions based on these fake comments. It's also important to remember in this, and we're going to talk about the amendments that we haven't talked about in the next section. But the Fifth Amendment has what's called the Takings Clause, and it prohibits the government from taking my property without compensation. If the government passes a rule or regulation that harms me, I can sue under the Fifth Amendment claiming that it's a taking. If the government wants to build the interstate highway across my land, then they have to properly compensate me for doing that. Here's two simple examples. When they built Hoover Dam, it dammed up the Colorado River and created Lake Mead. Well, there were property under Lake Mead. People owned pieces of land that are now under Lake Mead, and under the Constitution, they're entitled to compensation. We have now the U.S. border issue. Are we going to build fences across the entire U.S. border? Well, it turns out that a lot of the land on both southern and northern borders is privately owned land. You can't just build a fence across my land without compensating me somehow. And there are already a number of people who have sued saying, hey, I don't want this fence, I don't want this thing on my land, I need to get the right compensation if you're going to do it, blah, blah, blah. And it's going to take courts a while to resolve the constitutional issues of building a structure across somebody's private land, especially if that person doesn't want you to build that across their private land. So there's the book that contains all of the federal regulations, and it's not really a book, it's a giant set of books, and this is how many pages are in it by president. So when Ronald Reagan left office, there were 122,000 pages. When Clinton left office, 141,000 pages. When Bush left office, 163,000 pages. And when Obama left office, 185,000 pages. If you look at that, and you could go back before Reagan, but basically you get 20,000 pages of president, right? And it doesn't matter whether they're Republican presidents or Democratic presidents or whatever, you get about 20,000 pages of president. There have been, in the first 2 years of the Trump administration, a decline in the total number of pages, but an increase in the total number of rules. And we'll talk about that a little bit here before too long. So here's an example of a rule and how things change. A long time ago, there were frozen cherry pies all sold all over America that didn't actually have cherries in them. They had fake things and cherry flavor, and so there's a rule, a federal rule, regulation that says you have to have a certain number of actual cherries in a pie to call it a cherry pie. Just like ice cream, there's a certain amount of milk you have to have in ice cream to call it ice cream, which is why Dairy Queen doesn't sell ice cream. They sell DQ because there's not enough milk in their DQ to call it ice cream. So we have these rules. The only pie we have these rules for, though, is cherry pie. One of the things that the Trump administration is working on is they want to delete the cherry pie rule. Turns out that it's incredibly difficult to delete a rule. It is far easier to change a rule. So even though we looked at those long list of how many pages of rules there are, that doesn't tell you the whole story because you don't usually get rid of rules anymore. You change the rule. So the pages stay there. The rule becomes different. So if they change the rule from X cherries to 0 cherries, that's easier to do than to remove the rule. And so soon there may be a rule that says you have to have no cherries in a cherry pie to call it cherry pie. Just like there's no rule that says you have to have pumpkin in your pumpkin pie. Okay? The changing of the rules goes through the process of there's a proposal and then there's public comment and then it's much harder to get rid of it, so they don't tend to get rid of it, they tend to change them. You need to think about the complexity of these things again, and complexity. We talk about regulation, we talk about what the Constitution says, we talk about my rights versus your rights versus. One of the consequences of burning coal is that when we burn coal, we put mercury into the atmosphere. Mercury is a highly toxic chemical. The reason that we don't want you to throw out your LED light bulb when it burns out is that there's mercury in there. And if you throw that light bulb into the trash, that mercury is going to go into the ground north of town. And who knows where that mercury is going to go over time. Okay? So mercury goes into the atmosphere. Most of the mercury that goes in the atmosphere ends up in the oceans. So we look and we have tuna. Tuna have such high concentrations of mercury in them that a lot of tuna is really not good for you to eat. There are studies that say if you eat a 3-ounce piece of tuna, which is a pretty small piece of tuna, a 3-ounce piece of tuna, you get a week's worth, at least a week's worth of the amount of mercury that you can consume, and that eating a lot of tuna is very unhealthy for you. So here we have, if we put rules on the coal people to protect the tuna people, right? There's a tuna industry and a coal industry. If we protect the coal industry and we burn more coal, there's going to be more mercury in the tuna, and the tuna industry is going to be hurt, and consumers who eat that tuna are going to be hurt. And so you have this trade-off, again, economics about trade-offs, rules, profits, money. You can't fix one thing without maybe hurting something else. And we have this tuna versus coal versus tuna versus coal. And I'm not picking the tuna over the coal or the coal over the tuna. I'm just saying here that the more coal we burn hurts the tuna industry. The less coal we burn helps the tuna industry. Whose rules are we interested in? Whose profits are we interested in? Where's the money? This is why these things are complex. Okay? They're never simple. So, again, I'll put the tuna back up there, and I put the tuna back up there again. It is likely that at least certain kinds of tuna, like bluefin tuna, that's highly prized in sushi, are going to go extinct, or we're going to only get them if they are farmed, if they're grown in captivity, essentially. And tuna grown in captivity, most of the fish we grow in captivity are GMO fish, which have other questions that we need to ask. But that whole food chain, we don't catch, on average, tuna aren't nearly as big as they used to be because they're not as old. Bluefin tuna in particular, which are highly prized by sushi people. They think they're the best tasting food in the world is bluefin tuna, and they're just dying out. And we're getting rid of them because they're so highly valued. There was one really large fish that sold for over $1 million. When you do that math, where you're talking like $1,000 a pound for that tuna, it's not uncommon for these tunas to be sold for extraordinarily high prices because an old bluefin tuna that's been out there and swimming and doing its thing is going to get tastier and tastier and tastier. And okay, so we have this, again, trade-off. The sushi industry, the restaurateurs, the tuna fishermen, their lives are dependent on their being able to catch the tuna. If we run out of tuna, now we have a tuna issue. Okay? I put the little picture of the seahorse with the Q-tip. Plastic in the ocean. We hopefully know all about plastic in the ocean. That we here in the world, we like to drink plastic bottles and have straws, but then we throw that stuff out, or we put it down, throw it onto the ground, and it gets washed out into the ocean. There's studies that say we're within 10 years of there being more plastic by weight than fish in the ocean. There's the whole mid-ocean Pacific Gyre, which is just full of plastic. They find dead whales on the beach now whose stomachs are just full of plastic. Again, do we ban straws? Starbucks is going to ban straws. They're going to get rid of straws. Do we ban plastic bottles? What's the deal for us? What's the trade-off? What's the way to deal with this issue? Right? I put our planet up there, and I put a little global warming picture up there. I'm not going to debate whether there's global warming. The evidence is undeniable, and you can argue that maybe people aren't responsible or whatever, but ocean levels are rising. CO2 levels are rising. You can look at the last 500,000 years, and you can see that this is a highly unusual period compared to any time in the last 500,000 years, blah, blah, blah. What's the trade-off? What's the deal if we think about global warming? If we act, if we do the things that some people would have us do, some people are going to lose now, some people are going to gain now. In the future, different other people will lose and gain. So if you're a coal miner and your job is dependent upon us coaling it, well, hey, you might have a different view of this than somebody who's 18 years old and thinking about what their life is going to be like in 50 or 60 years if Florida's underwater. Anyway, complex issues that different people are going to view different ways. Complex issues that different people are going to complex issues that different people are going to view different ways because they have different costs and benefits attached to them.